if I become Prime Minister, there will be a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty. He didn't deliver. He let us down. He spent 2011 and 2012 saying there won't be a referendum under me. In fact, he even said in 2012 it would be against the national interest to have a referendum. Then what happened? Towards the end of 2012, through a series of by-elections, UKIP started to spread like a purple rash across the body politic, and there was no known cure. So he decided the thing to do was to say, I'll give you a referendum. I'm surprised that Miliband hasn't offered a referendum, and that is why the biggest growth in UKIP support in this election campaign is from Labour in the north of England. But let me say this to you, Mike. The only way that Cameron will deliver this referendum, and certainly the only way we will get a full, free and fair referendum, is if there are enough UKIP MPs in the House of Commons to make sure we get a proper referendum and not a stitch-up.
Mike, back to you.
But we know you're only going to get a few seats, and all you're going to do is let Labour in because you're dividing the Tory vote. Most of your supporters are disaffected Tories.
No, Mike.
So,
no, Mike. No, Mike. I'm sorry, Mike. You're wrong. You're out of touch. You're reading the Daily Mail too much. That's what they want you to believe. It's this desperate attempt to get people to vote for Cameron. The last big electoral test was Rochester and Stroud, the by-election. And in that election, Mark Reckless got 42% of the vote, and only a third of that vote came from people who'd voted Conservative in 2010. The vast majority of our support is not from the Conservatives, and arguably there are seats in the country where Conservative voters ought to be voting UKIP, where we're the challengers to Labour. So there is no question that a vote for UKIP is a vote that lets Miliband in. Our support comes from across the board, but I repeat the point. Even if UKIP has a relatively small number of MPs, given the tight arithmetic that we're going to be looking at next Friday, that could be crucial, that could make the difference. And if Cameron had a majority on his own, I think we get a stitch-up.
And so lastly on this, Mr Farage, even in seats that you would admit now are perhaps beyond realistic hope of gaining, you still wouldn't say to your supporters, actually, go Conservative, because you have said you would prefer to see Cameron in number 10 than Mr Miliband.
Well, what I've said is that Mr Miliband has turned his back on the British people and won't offer a referendum, which I believe to be absolutely key to British politics. But I would say to UKIP voters around the country, vote UKIP, because by doing so, you're voting for change. And even in those seats where we can't win, every vote for UKIP is a vote not just for a change of policy, but actually for a change to our electoral system.
Come Friday, you've got that handful of seats. David Cameron, let's say first, gives you a call. Talk us a little bit through, if you would, your red lines, what you would want to achieve if you thought a deal could be done, that you would switch some support, you would offer support to the Conservatives.
Yeah, I mean, look, we will not be going into coalition with anybody, regardless how well we do in this election. I don't want a ministerial...
Some kind of deal?
I don't want a ministerial car, but I would like to drive the agenda. And that can be done by saying, look, let's look at your deficit reduction plans. You know, are you actually serious? Because, you know, the biggest lie of this campaign is that the economy has done well and the government have met their targets. The national debt has doubled in 5 years and no one's talking about it. So we would say we would support you on your budget if we can see serious deficit reduction plans. And in return for that, what we would want is a referendum to be held by the end of this year. There's no point waiting.
By the end of this year?
Yeah, there's no point waiting till 2017. I mean, there is no fundamental renegotiation. But then the key, Nick, is how is this referendum conducted? Are there going to be the same spending limits for both sides? Is there going to be an ombudsman appointed to make sure that, in particular, the BBC actually gives both sides of the argument, you know, an equal go? And crucially, who votes? Who gets to... And I say this because there are 4 million EU citizens who can vote in European elections in Britain, can vote in local elections in Britain, but cannot vote in general elections. I want to know from Mr Cameron, does he want them to vote in the referendum or not? So how this is conducted is absolutely crucial.
How do you think they should vote?
I don't. I think British passport holders only should be voting in a referendum on the future of this country, and that, I think, is a crucial part of that negotiation.
What about another red line, 2% target or recommendation on defence spending?
Well, that won't be a red line target, but what we are saying is that we are now the party of defence. We want defence spending to increase to 2% immediately and to go up after that. The way we've cut our armed forces, frankly, is shameful, and the way we've treated our veterans is even worse. I've really been shocked. You know, I knew people were coming back from Afghanistan badly physically and mentally damaged and not perhaps getting the care they deserved. What I hadn't realised until recently, there are 9,000 ex-servicemen living rough on our streets. and it's about time we as a country repaid the debt for the service that they've given us.
Let's go to another call. Terry is in Croydon. Terry, you're through to Nigel Farage. Go ahead, Terry.
Morning all. I hope we get to see your pledges up on a pub specials board as soon as possible. Mr. Farage.
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
I like that, Terry.
Yes, I think you might see that in a newspaper near you soon. Let's move to your question, Terry. You've given them an idea at UKIP. Go on.
In the likely event of another Scottish referendum, despite the fact that the no vote's holding quite strong at 50, or certainly above 50%, despite all that's going on, what can be done to stop any nationalist party threatening separation from walking away from the national debt in the way that the SNP was threatening at the last one? Can it be national? Can the national debt be nationalised?
Well, I think the I think the SNP ought to recognise that a lot of the banks that were bailed out were actually Scottish-based banks. A point that clearly seems to have escaped them. If somebody declares UDI and separates and doesn't intend to do so on friendly terms, then then life can be difficult. But actually, Terry, in some ways, we're back to what I said a moment ago. Our electoral system is bust both ways. It's bust in the sense that UKIP are going to get, the bookmakers say over 4 million votes, and we probably won't get seats in line with that. And yet the SNP are on 45% of the vote and could win 100% of the seats. So I think the whole electoral system needs to be reformed. And if it was, then the threat of the SNP actually would not be quite as serious as it is. I personally think that despite the surge in the SNP, when it really comes down to it, remember that the great Salmond promise to the Scots was they could survive economically because North Sea oil would bring them in £7.9 billion in taxes every year. Ever since that moment, the price of oil has collapsed, and I do not believe, even in a second referendum, that Scotland would separate. The economic arguments just don't suggest that would work.
A quick response from you, Terry.
I can see that. It's interesting that in Europe, a less than 5% vote in many of their systems wouldn't even register as a vote to get seats. But I'm hoping it will change the first past the post system this election.
Yeah, I mean, Tony Blair, when he first became Prime Minister, said we must look at everything in an attempt to modernise Britain. He asked Roy Jenkins, who'd been a former Chancellor of the Exchequer and European Commissioner, and he asked Jenkins to set up a commission, and Jenkins spent a lot of time, and Jenkins concluded that what we ought to do is have a system that is called AV+. And what it means is that one man or woman would continue to represent a constituency like South Thanet, albeit with a slightly larger number of electors, and you would then have a second ballot paper where you could vote Green, or vote Monster Raving Loony, or if you wanted, vote Labour, Tory, Lib Dem, UKIP, whatever, and that last 20% of seats will be made up with that second ballot paper. Because you see, one of the problems is that the older generation voted because they felt they'd fought 2 world wars for us to be a free country. The younger generation don't get that. I've spoken to young family members of mine who live in seats where there are massive majorities for a party they don't want to vote for, and their attitude is, why on earth, if it's raining on Thursday evening, would I walk down to the local primary school? We've got to find a way where socialists in Esher feel it's worth going to vote.
You mentioned the BBC earlier. I need to get your comment on a story in one of the newspapers today. A UKIP government or UKIP-influenced government would kill off Doctor Who.
Oh, that was a comment Andrew Marr made. What I said was the BBC is bloated, anachronistic, is doing many things that it doesn't need to do. And he said, does that mean you'd get rid of Doctor Who and Strictly Come Dancing? No. I said the BBC has an important role as a public service broadcaster. It is an important global brand for this country, and actually Doctor Who is a global brand, but why do we have to spend all this money paying a lot of money to I think rather unfunny left-wing comedians on a variety of shows, but the worrying point is this: the dominance of the BBC website, particularly at a local and regional level, is putting out of business small local newspapers, small local news agencies, and I actually think it's, in a sense, the BBC in this regard is actually a threat to proper, open media debate.
You're aware, I know, of the Ofcom guidelines. How come, Mr Farage, on the telly sometimes at night, I don't even know you're fighting a general election. I see more of Nicola Sturgeon than I do of you.
Yeah, or actually, no, Leanne Wood. 90% of Britain can't vote for Leanne Wood, and here am I leading a party with 635 candidates contesting the general election, and we have been reduced by the news at 10, day after day, frankly, to being a bit part player. And I know some people, oh, well, Nigel's just whinging. Well, no, I'm not whinging, I'm angry. I'm angry, and my supporters are angry. And
Well,
UKIP
remind
voters are
everybody
angry.
you are deemed one of the four main...
Yeah, Ofcom said there are four major parties in British politics, and included us, and I have absolutely no complaints about the way people like you, ITV, Channel 4, Channel 5, Sky, the way we've been treated by all of those outfits is absolutely right, and we've been on and we've been asked tough questions, and it's not been easy, but it's not supposed to be.
No.
But to be ignored. I mean, I saw a BBC London News sort of 10:30 at night thing about housing policy, and they had the Lib Dems, Labour, Conservative, and Greens. Our manifesto policy on housing actually received a commendation from the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, and yet the BBC on their London programming didn't even cover it. So I'm less than happy.
Scilla is in Richmond. She'll be happy. Scilla, you're through to Nigel Farage. Go ahead.
Oh, hello. I would like to ask Mr. Nigel Farage about how he can help East European people to get proper wages in East Europe, how he can influence multinational companies in East Europe to pay the people properly so they don't have to come to this country to live. And it means the immigration problem will be solved. Since 2004, East Europe joined the EU, the salaries should be 70% up by now, and it's less than 35%. I really would like to actually do a survey to see how much the salary is.
Scilla, stay on the line. Let's hear from Nigel Farage.
Scilla, actually, I really am pleased you've asked that question, because there's a side of this equation that nobody ever talks about, but I warned about in 2004 in the European Parliament. The overnight transition, effectively, from the communist system to a democratic system, but then to join the European Union with open borders, I predicted in 2004 would be a disaster for both. I predicted it would be a disaster for Britain because it would drive down the wages of ordinary people. But what people forget I said it would actually strip out of many of those countries much of their young talent. I went to Lithuania in September and I sat down with the Prime Minister and I talked to him. And in 2004, Lithuania's population was 2.8 million. It is now 1.8 million. You are looking at depopulation in many of these countries, Scilla, and you're also looking at the young doctors, the young lawyers, the brightest and the best are leaving, and so in many ways, some of these former communist countries are less attractive places for firms to invest than they were before. And I haven't got a solution for you. I wish I had, other than to say what we've done and to make this overnight transition that we have is stupid. And I think the future for countries like Lithuania is actually quite bleak.
Thank you for that, Scilla. Can we talk briefly about South Thanet? It's an extraordinary area, Mr Farage. You have relative wealth of areas such as Broadstairs, and then you have, well, not grinding poverty, but certainly some of the struggle street in places such as Ramsgate and Margate. What's happened down here?
30 years ago, there were 3 coal mines active in this area, providing a lot of jobs. The mines closed. Then a Channel Tunnel opened, which meant that the Sally Line, which was the ferry service that ran from Ramsgate Harbour, closed. We then saw Pfizer's, who had a very big investment down at Sandwich, nearly a couple of thousand people. Pfizer's closed down, and the last absolute hammer blow for the area was that the airfield at Manston closed last year. So this area has suffered hammer blow after hammer blow. I think this area's got huge potential. I mean, you've got more sand here. I mean, you've got to go as far as Bournemouth down the coast to find as many sandy beaches as you've got here. The place has got phenomenal history. I mean, just in a few weeks' time on Broadstairs Beach, there'll be the bicentenary of the Waterloo Dispatch arriving there. Ramsgate Harbour, where, of course, the little boats went to Dunkirk. There's an amazing history here. The place needs money. The place needs investment. And forget about me for a moment, but on this Thursday, there is going to be an election for Thanet District Council. Every single seat is up. And we are standing in every single one of those seats. And what we have said is that if we win and take control, we will put a compulsory purchase order in place to reopen Manston, to try and give it a chance, and to try to send out a message that Thanet's open for business and get some freight business coming back through the ferry terminal. And this is about investment, it is about jobs, and I've certainly in some of the poorer bits of Ramsgate met young people, and there's a certain sense of hopelessness.
Why do you suppose neither David Cameron nor Ed Miliband have been down to support their respective candidates?
Well, probably because they think their candidates might lose, and that would be a huge embarrassment to them. But you see, let's be honest. If I hadn't put my name forward to fight this constituency, nobody would be talking about it at all. And there's so much of our country.
Yours is the most talked about constituency.
Well, now it is, yeah.
The Media Standards Trust, you're like 50% more than the next most spoken about constituency, which is Sheffield Hallam. So you have brought attention here, undoubtedly.
Yeah, well, and I hope that's a good thing, because I hope actually people say, "Wow, look at this place! It's got all these amazing natural resources."
While we're on the subject of leaders, the General Secretary of Unite, Len McCluskey, gave an exclusive interview to LBC. He had this question for you, Mr. Farage.
Of course, he's a threat not just to the working class vote, but he's a threat, in my opinion, to the cohesion of a civilised society. His party attempts to give respectability to prejudice and discrimination.
Is he racist?
Well, there's no doubt in my mind that UKIP is a racist party. I think if you listen to him, all you constantly hear is that all the faults in our community are as a result of foreigners. That is driven by a kind of racist xenophobia.
Nigel Farage, respond to Len McCluskey, if you would.
Remarkable, isn't it? The trade unions were set up to support working men and women, and yet he chooses to attack the one party that is brave enough to say that the massive oversupply of unskilled and semi-skilled labour into Britain has driven down the wages of ordinary people, so that the minimum wage has actually, for 1.5 million people, now become the maximum wage. So Mr. McCluskey is working directly against the interests of working people, and actually is on the side of the big corporate businesses who benefit so much from cheap labour. So there's an irony there. But what I would really say is this Mr. McCluskey is the man who has funded a number of organisations who have behaved with threats, intimidation, violence, and our bully boys, all based on a complete lie, willful lie, that UKIP is a racist party. And I think the truth of it is this. I think Mr. McCluskey is terrified. I think he realises that our message is beginning to resonate more with his trade union members than his message, and that's what I think it's all about.
John's in Guildford. You're through to Nigel Farage. Go ahead, John.
Hello, Mr. Farage.
Good morning.
First, can I say my wife's absolutely furious with me for ringing and asking this, because she's a supporter of yours. I'm more open-minded. Why did MEPs vote to keep secret their expenses, and which way did you vote on that?
MEPs have always voted to keep their expenses secret.
Including you?
I was in and out of there in 3 hours the other day. There were 80 pages of votes. I was told yesterday that I might have voted the wrong way. If so, I will change my vote.
When you say voted the wrong way, what does that mean, Mr. Fraser?
Voted not for disclosure.
Right.
But look,
how could you have done that?
Because there were 80 pages of votes. It was like that. It was 2 hours of voting with as many as one vote every 4 seconds. I mean, it was like early morning aerobics, with your hand going up and down.
So you couldn't get that right, Nigel Farage.
Well, sometimes, do you know something? And let me tell you the truth. When MEPs vote, there is so much to vote on. They've never read the documents at all. They are handed them by members of staff. Such is the volume of voting in Brussels.
You're going to amend it.
But John, be in no mistake. UKIP are the turkeys that would vote for Christmas. I don't want there to be any British MEPs. I don't see the need. I'm perfectly happy with British MPs going to a Council of Europe chamber to talk about things we can do jointly within Europe, but I don't want a European Parliament, and I don't want any of the cost of it.
Email questions. James in Essex. Can Nigel Farage tell us the truth? It said he doesn't get on with his colleague Douglas Carswell. Is that correct? Talk of tension.
No, but that's again the press doing their absolute utmost best to try and drive wedges. Look, I've said it before and I say it again. I think Douglas Carswell and Mark Reckless have proved to be two of the most honourable people in modern British politics.
You did have a clash over this overseas patients with HIV, didn't you?
No, when Douglas Carswell was asked about it, he said he thought it should be a national health service, not an international health service, which actually is exactly what I was saying. Douglas phrases things slightly differently to the way that I do. Hey, we all phrase things differently, but it was perfectly clear from Douglas's answer that there wasn't an inch of daylight between us.
Kenneth in Dartford, I can't wait to hear what Nigel Farage makes of Ed Miliband's tombstone. I think he means tablet of pledges.
Yeah. Well, if he loses, it'll become a millstone. And a millstone round his neck. And as a bad back sufferer, I would say, Ed, you've made a terrible mistake. I think goodness only knows who advises these people, but it's not a very clever thing to have done.
Also, we could do with a comment on the story of the front page of the Times. You may be aware of this. This is a possible recurrence of the Trojan horse problems. We looked at this earlier in the programme. Head teachers are claiming that some are receiving death threats, some, in some instances, even dead animals, cats and dogs being strung on the railings of schools. This is reportedly because some schools are seeking to teach that homosexuality is not perverse and is of the norm.
We have a cultural clash with some elements, some of the extreme elements of the Muslim community. Mercifully, it's a very, very small percentage. The question is, Nick, how we deal with it. And can I say this, and I want to challenge the Labour Party to come back on this programme and answer me. There was a meeting that took place in Hodge Hill in Birmingham 2 nights ago. There were 4 Labour politicians speaking, including one very senior one, Liam Byrne, the former secretary.
Who wrote the note.
Okay. That meeting took place in Hodge Hill. It was a political Labour Party meeting. It was a segregated meeting. Men sat on the right-hand side and women sat on the left-hand side. And if that is not giving in, if that is not turning our backs on a century and more of advancement for women's rights, then I don't know what is. I believe that's got no place in modern civilised Britain. And it really answers your question. Unless we're prepared to stand up for who we are, then we will be bullied by some of those extreme elements. And I want to know from the Labour Party, how in the name of your party can you have allowed that to have happened?
Final question. Asif is in Hounslow. You're through to Nigel Farage. Asif.
Good morning, Mr. Farage, and good morning, Nigel. How are you?
Good morning. Very well, thank you.
My question to you is that what would be in your manifesto for people with disabilities in Britain to encourage them in the politics, as all the political parties have said a lot of things, but nothing has been done practically to allow disabled people to have an equal opportunity in the politics to represent themselves. According to the population in Britain about the disabled people, there needs to be a 65-member MPs from the disabled community to represent them equally in the parliament.
Asif, I must let Mr. Farage go because we're on fairly strict time limits. I do apologise, Mr. Farage.
I mean, first things first, we would remove the ATOS system of assessing disability and get that more back to local GPs, and I think people might feel they've been treated with more respect. Asif, I don't believe in quotas. For whether it's for women or ethnic minorities or disabled people. I never have and I never ever will. But you're right that a parliament does need to be reflective of the people in society. And one of the guys that's standing for me here for the local district council is blind, and I go out with him and his guide dog knocking on doors. We should do everything we can to encourage disabled people to be in the House of Commons. There was a Labour MP called Jack Ashley who was stone deaf, and actually he was an inspiration for people in the deaf community. So the sense of Asif's question is right, but we don't do it by quotas, we do it by encouragement.
Now, lastly, Mr. Farage, you mentioned the importance of Ramsgate in World War II. This is where many of the D-Day craft went from. Are you ready to take our beer taste test?
It's a bit early even for me.
We have one half of Spitfire and we have one half of Beck's.
Right.
Are you ready?
Yes.
Let me show I get this right. Yes, I know what it is. Okay, so in your own time, Mr. Farage, choose whichever. I'm going to ask which is the good old English or British Spitfire and which is the Beck's. Nigel Farage.
Okay.
Taking the first swig, and a healthy swig as well at 9:31.
Well, that is absolutely delicious. Let's try the other one.
So it's looking like it could. Second glass goes up, and another healthy swig.
Oh my God.
Grimace.
Foul Eurofizz.
So the British beer is...
Oh, the winner every single time. No question about it.
Absolutely right. You have passed the beer taste
You
test.
know what? If I didn't pass that, I really would be in trouble, wouldn't I?
Let's see how the voters go a little bit later
you
in the
very
week.
much.
Thank you, Nigel Farage, leader of UKIP. You've been listening to Election Call, where we're giving you the chance to question a senior political figure from the main parties in the run-up to the general election. Stay tuned to LBC to question leaders from the other parties across the week. Go to lbc.co.uk for a list of all the candidates. 9:31 LBC News is next with Lisa Aziz.